And we are live. Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and good evening. We're so glad that you're all joining us here today via Facebook and Zoom. Firstly, we'd like to wish all of our service members, past and present, a happy Veterans Day, and thank you for your service. Today, we're excited to have two scholars and intellectuals that have worked toward a better understanding of Islam within itself and its better relationship with its co-religionists in Christianity. Both Islam and Christianity are the dominant religions in both terms of size and variety throughout the globe. So it's quite obvious that a good relationship between both faiths is critical for global peace. Unfortunately, more often than not, at least what's reported and what's talked about, are things that are, refer to tensions that rise to the forefront and are highlighted, whether it was the Crusades or President Bush's former reference to the Crusades as it related to the war on terror. While the aforementioned invoke deep misgivings, there are plenty of areas of opportunity to know one another and potentially work together. The Quran states, "We have revealed to you, O Muhammad, the book in truth, confirming that which preceded it of the scripture and as a criterion over it. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed and do not follow their inclinations away from what has come to you of the truth. To each of you, we prescribed a law and a method. Had Allah willed, He would have made you one nation united in religion, but He intended to test you in what He has given to you. So race all that is good. To Allah is your return altogether, and He will then inform you concerning that over which you used to differ." In my professional space, I have seen a deep commitment and purpose from both Muslims and Christians alike toward working toward ending religious persecution of minorities throughout the world. And there's also an obvious love and reverence toward the Prophet Jesus. While theological differences definitely arise with respect to the entity that is Jesus, his role in both faiths are oversized and necessary. Today, we are excited to have Dr. Craig Considine, the author of the recently published book, People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounter with Christians, and Mustafa Akyol, the author of The Islamic Jesus, How the King of the Jews Became a Prophet of the Muslims. Craig's book is amazing in the fact that it deeply looks into the backgrounds of the early Christians and the first Muslim engagement with their relationships and what precedents that type of engagement led to. I am also proud to announce it is the best-selling book on the history of Islam on Amazon. So congratulations, Craig. Mustafa, you also did a fantastic job. I loved your book. It looked at Kalam, eschatology, and even Islamic Christology. And I think that's another conversation for another talk. I think in the future, we're definitely going to have to involve both of you and a Jewish scholar also. My understanding of your thesis, and it might not be a very popular idea, that those influenced by the Apostle James later played a role in diffusing some of their ideas, and some of those ideas were latched onto some early Muslims. Without going too much further into spoilers, I am happy to introduce our two speakers today. I'll largely allow these two giants to converse with one another, and toward the latter part of the program, we'll open the floor to Q&As. Feel free to write your questions on the Facebook live stream or Zoom's Q&A. With that, I'll get started. Mustafa Akyol is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam, and modernity. Since 2013, he has also been a frequent opinion writer for the New York Times, covering politics and religion in the Muslim world. He is the author of several books, including Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, The Islamic Jesus, and Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. His books have been translated into many languages and praised in different outlets, throughout different outlets. Meanwhile, Islam Without Extremes was banned in Malaysia for challenging the authority of the religious police. The Thinking Muslim, a popular podcast, recently defined Akyol as probably the most notable Muslim modernist and reformer. And in July 2021, the Prospect magazine of the UK listed him amongst the world's top 50 thinkers. Congrats on that. Dr. Craig Considine is an award-winning professor and the best-selling author of The Humanity of Muhammad, A Christian View. He is recognized as an authority in interfaith dialogue, particularly Christian and Muslim relations. Dr. Considine has written several books for the field of Islamic studies, including People of the Book, Muslims in America, Examining the Facts and Islam, Race and Pluralism in the Pakistani Diaspora. Throughout the years, Dr. Considine's peer-reviewed articles have appeared in Sociology and Religions, and his op-eds have been published in Newsweek and Foreign Policy. He is also experienced in filmmaking, having directed the critically acclaimed documentary Journey into America. He's a practicing Roman Catholic. Dr. Craig, let's get started with you.
Shahid, thank you so much. And to the American Muslim Institution for organizing this event. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to share this stage alongside Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa's book, The Islamic Jesus, was one of 5 or 6 books that really informed the writing of my own book. And this is like a great kind of hats off testament to another scholar here. The Islamic Jesus was not only beautifully written, Mustafa has a great skill of communicating complex ideas and heavily loaded topics like Christology. Mustafa has a way of communicating these things in a way that's kind of easy to digest. And this is what I try to do as an academic. You try to unpack the quite complicated in a simple way. And I think even beyond this, I learned so much about Christianity through Mustafa's book. And it really made me wonder, when I was growing up in Boston, going to Catholic school, why wasn't I informed about the Nicene Creed? Why wasn't I informed about the Council of Nicaea or some of these early Christian groups like the Ebionites? And Mustafa, you talk about all that in your book. So it was a huge eye-opener to me. It gave my own faith more depth, understanding where some of these Christian doctrinal things are coming from. So Mustafa, if you don't mind me kind of getting us started here, what motivated you to write this really legendary book?
Thank you so much, Craig. And I mean, it's a pleasure and honor to be on the same stage with you. And I really admire your work. Your books are also disseminating very important truths to a Western audience and or whomever reads it, really. And also, I think you've taken this mission of really building an understanding between Muslims and Christians, and of course other faith traditions, at a time when there's so many biases and misperceptions, and the world is a complicated place. We have a lot of problems and unfortunately prejudices, and also we are at a time when people from the big divide, like from both sides, see the most disturbing voices on the other side and say this is who they really are, although that is really the craziest person or idea or out there, the most radical one. And we certainly have a bunch of them, many of them, unfortunately, in the Muslim world. And there are some unpleasant people, I think, in the Western scene as well. So I really appreciate what you're doing, and it's a pleasure. And thanks to Shahid for bringing us together today. So, and thanks to everybody who joined us. Well, what led me to write this book, Islamic Jesus? Well, I mean, as I say in the introduction, the book's story began like in early 2001 or 2000. I mean, just 20 years ago. Really, when I got a copy of the New Testament as a missionary gift. I was like in Istanbul and walking in the biggest street of Istanbul, and missionaries were active, and somebody gave me a New Testament, and I knew, of course, of Christianity, but I hadn't gone through that much. But when I read it very carefully, and like I'm a very like Quran focused Muslims. Like, I mean, I studied whole my night studying the Quran, and besides my college and everything education. And I found a lot of things that resonated and fascinated me. I found some parts that, that don't go that well with my theology, especially Pauline letters. I said certain parts of it. But I said, oh my, then I came to the letter of James, and I was like fascinated by it. And I said, like, who's James? Like, oh, I looked at him, and he's a brother of Jesus. Like, did he have brothers? Like, how is that possible? Like, and why do we not know this? Oh, Christians even don't know that much. Like, and of course, there's a discussion whether he's the brother or a cousin. The term brother is used literally or metaphorically. I think Catholic tradition defined them as cousins because of the perpetual virginity of Mary. But anyway, so the thing is, that was then I read more. I mean, I was like, in those years, I was like doing my master's on other things, but then I was so into all this religious literature. And I got a sense that, there is something in Christianity that is profoundly similar to Islam. Then I read early Christianity, different sects. I said, there are Christians who actually look at Jesus a bit like us, right? Like, oh, they were called heretics, but who knows? So, Arianism was the first, of course, thing you see there. Then, in Boğaziçi University Library, I looked into religious history of Christianity books. I learned about Jewish Christianity a little bit. So these ideas were in my head. But then by 2015, when, I was like thinking, what should I write next? And Reza Aslan's book came. And Reza is a good friend. Of course, he's a very prominent writer in America. And I read his book, and his book is very successful and beautifully argued. But when I read his book, I said, well, Reza kind of brings a secular perspective on this, right? I mean, Jesus defines Jesus more of like a political, maybe a rebel against Rome. And I said, well, I don't exactly feel like that. And that's not what Islam says, by the way. Maybe the fact that Muslims writing about Jesus should include Muslims writing about Jesus from an Islamic point of view, not just a secular academic point of view. And I proposed the book, and my agent, Jeff, who had published my first book in the US, he said, oh, good, St. Martin's is interested. And then I spent a few years working on this book, and it came out by 2017. But thank you. I mean, I'm honored that, you found it helpful, and it influenced even some of your thoughts.
So one of the ideas that really stuck out to me, and this is something that I've been raising in a lot of my talks about my new book, People of the Book, Prophet Muhammad's Encounters with Christians. And I don't know where in the book, Mustafa, you say this, but I'm pretty sure you explicitly say it, and I quote it in the book. You say that Prophet Muhammad was not anti-Christian. He was anti-Nicene. Mm-hmm. And that is a link to the Council of Nicaea in 325. And we have multiple councils, right? And these councils must be known to Christians and Muslims to understand how ideas of Jesus developed. Mm-hmm. Right. So then we kind of get into this Unitarian versus Trinitarian struggle, in essence.
Indeed.
So,
and sorry, just one thing. I mean, when I read early Christianity, I was also impressed by the fact that, well, Christians discussed intensely and disagreed intensely on the nature of Christ. And even if, those who would say, okay, these are Trinitarian Christians by and large, is it two separate essences or one? Like there are endless monophysites and the Byzantine ones and others and Nestorians, and early Christianity was so complicated. It's a bit like our Muslim discussions about whether the Quran is created or uncreated. We all accept it's word of God, but was it with God since eternity, or did God utter that at a certain point in time? So those discussions are there. And one thing religions have their heresies, quote unquote, right? But we can, if you're a Catholic, of course, you will see this is the right way, and I respect that. And that's the way a Sunni Muslim will think about the Shia, understanding of certain things. But I'm also of the persuasion that, well, we can be on a certain path, but we should understand that the other people really genuinely believe in what they're doing, honestly and sincerely, and maybe they have some grounds as well. So I believe in looking into the history of our faith from the footsteps, or from the position of the so-called heretics as well, unless they were vicious people that killed fellow believers or other people as well. So that's why, I mean, I think, for example, today I believe Sunnis and Shiites need a better understanding that it's a political division. They have a political narrative. You know, they are coming from somewhere. So you should at least understand that, instead of saying these people are, you know, taking heretical positions. And in the history of Christianity, the nature of Christ is such a fascinating discussion that there were Christians who were pious Christians who believed in Christ, but took what people called lower Christology. And
Exactly.
the Quran resonates with that very strongly, with utmost respect to Christ and Mary. And when we see this, we can, you know, see the matrix that's out there actually between our faiths.
Yeah. So one thing I noticed when I was writing people of the book, I'm pretty confident in saying this, that Muhammad, you know, according to the sources, we know he was interacting, you know, Bahira the monk comes up, Waraka ibn Nafal, we have the Abyssinian Christians, the Christians of Najran, and so on. And according to my research, folks like Waraka and Bahira may have been more in line with what James was kind of saying, with a stricter Unitarianism, a stricter kind of monotheism. But if my research is correct, the Abyssinians were adherents to the Council of Nicaea. And that's quite interesting, because if you take the first Hijra, which is really one of the first real significant encounters between Christians and Muslims, you know, Muhammad was saying about King Ibn Abjar, you know, this is a noble man, a wise man, a just man. And we're assuming here that Muhammad knew that they were perhaps aligned with the more Trinitarian way. And I find that to be quite important, you know, like he wasn't allowing something like a very specific doctrinal issue like the Trinity, wasn't preventing him from saying, hey, my people, go. These people will take care of you. So when did, you know, Mustafa, I'm wondering, because there are plenty of examples of the early Ummah when Muhammad was receiving prophecy, plenty of examples of cordial relations. And then we, of course, have some skirmishes. But can you talk a little bit about maybe the first 300-400 years of, you know, we're talking 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century, like what happened? Or as Bernard Lewis kind of wondered, you know, what went wrong between Christians and Muslims?
Christian Muslims?
Yeah.
Well, we should have 10 sessions on this, right? But here's what I can briefly say. First of all, you mentioned Waraka, who was the priest, of course, that is mentioned in the Christian, you know, in Mecca. And he was the person who confirmed that Prophet Muhammad is a prophet, right? Because he wasn't sure in the beginning. He thought demons were, you know, kind of possessing him after the first revelation. And he said, no, you are like Moses, right? And the Moses analogy is very interesting, because Prophet Muhammad is in many ways similar to Moses.
It's a law.
I mean, he's a lawgiver, but he's a receiver of divine revelation, but he himself isn't divine at all. I mean, he's just an ordinary human being, a moral, very pious human being, like exemplary human being, but he's a human being. And it's like a burning bush experience, right? On the mountaintop, he hears the first word and he doesn't know. And Waraka, who's a Christian, what kind of a Christian who he is, actually, we don't know. I mean,
it's tough. And I say that, I'm like, it's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, you can just guess. I mean, you can say he was not a Southern Baptist or something. I mean, whatever Eastern Christianity was there. I mean, so he was probably, was he a Jewish Christian? Hard to know. But the fact that he confirms shows that, I mean, in the first Christian that appears in the Islamic story is a Christian that actually confirms and supports Prophet Muhammad and gives him a direction for the future. So that's amazing. The second story, as you said, is the story of the escape to Abyssinia. And Prophet Muhammad, you know, and let's not forget, I mean, Islam, I always say this, Islam was born as a campaign against idolatry, right? Islam was born as monotheism finally coming to the Arabs too. It had come to the Jews, it had come to others, and now Arabs who were still idolatrous, they're being blessed by monotheism once again, and Prophet Muhammad is one of them, and he's bringing this to them. And for Muslims, So the enemy, if there is one, are the idolaters. I mean, that's all over the Quran, the mushrikun. And they are the enemy not just because they are polytheists, but they're also persecutors of Muslims, right? I mean, Muslims said to them, to you, your religion, to me, mine. So just allow us to be monotheists and proclaim this. No, they didn't allow that. So they're pagans, polytheists. That in itself, I think, should be covered by religious freedom. And you can find that message in the Quran. But they also persecuted. I mean, they tortured. I mean, they killed Muslims. And Prophet Muhammad told Muslims to flee the most, and it depends on which tribe you were. I mean, slaves and the people who had lesser protection were really targets. Go to Abyssinia. There's a Christian king who would be just, who turned out to be just. And so that's the second encounter between Muslims and Christians. Incredibly positive. There is also a verse in the Quran which tells as good news that the Romans will be victorious, right?
Yes.
Why Romans are victorious? Why is it important? Because Romans were Christians. Their enemies were Sassanid pagans. And the Meccan polytheists sympathized with the Sassanid Empire. And Muslims, like, our guys are the Romans, right? And the Romans are Byzantine Christians. So that's another thing that's right there in the Quran. And then when we come to Medina, Prophet Muhammad, of course, flees from Mecca because he's persecuted. Ultimately, they come close to assassinating him. And then they establish a political order here. And there are two stories here. One is the story of Christians of Najran, which you beautifully explained. Prophet Muhammad invites them, I mean, actually sends them an emissary about Islam. He sends letters. They come to learn what this new religion is, right? They're hosted in Medina. Prophet Muhammad allows them to pray in his own mosque, which is unthinkable today.
I mean,
right? Today, if you're, as a Christian, if you go to Mecca and Medina, there are signs saying that this is the last stop, right? You cannot enter there.
Yeah.
Prophet Muhammad allowed Christians to not just enter the Hijaz, Masjid al-Haram, but pray there in his own mosque. And I mean, the Trinity, the divinity of Christ issue turn out to be a disagreement. It's there. I mean, it's there. And whoever is lying, let the curse of God should be on that. I mean, even there's a statement about that. But I think nobody was lying. Everybody was believing sincerely in their theology. And Christians say, we will not give up with that. What happened after that is Prophet Muhammad, okay, you can go. You'll just pay us taxes, because it turned into a state, and state had its own interests and necessities.
Yeah. And it was really no different from what how the Byzantine Empire was
Byzantines
kind of
work in the
operating.
same way.
Yeah, right.
But the point is, they were given full amnesty, religious protection. They can worship their mosques. Their churches will not be touched. Their religion will not be disrespected. So Prophet Muhammad didn't convert their churches, for example, into a mosque, which later Muslims did. Hagia Sophia, there's a whole history there. But it's not in the example of Prophet Muhammad. Now, there is a second story, let's say maybe fourth at this point, but there's another story. There is a battle known as the Battle of Muta between Prophet Muhammad and the Byzantine forces. That's in the north, not in the south, the Christians of Najran, but in the north. But what happens there is, again, Prophet Muhammad sends letters to everybody. And actually, the first letter we went to the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius was welcome. So there was no problem there. But then one of the emissaries of Muslims were killed by an Arab tribe who happened to be Christian. And that incident provoked a military confrontation. And that battle is there. But it was not that we are Christians and we're attacking you. You killed our emissary, and that's the beginning of war. And still, I think in the world, probably it still works that way. Like that would be a cause of war.
Yes.
And there are verses in the Quran about that incident. It says, fight them until they're subdued and they're they pay taxes in Surah Al-Tawbah, which unfortunately Islamic jurisprudence took as the definitive verse about relation with Jews and Christians, so that you could conquer and you still respect their religion. It was a remarkable thing in that age, but from a position of power and supremacy. Now, my conviction, as some other Islamic scholars are arguing, that verse was contextual, and it was about those people who attacked Muslims in the first place. It was not a universal blueprint, but it was taken as a blueprint. Which brings me to some of the reform issues in Islam today. I mean, I think we should understand that Islamic law developed at a context of empire, war context. And we should understand politics as politics. It was maybe understandable at its time, but the politics of 7th century Arabia or Middle East are not eternal. What is eternal is our theologies, right? Our ethics. And when I look into those, I see certainly a monotheistic framework. I see a connection, strong connection and sympathy for Christianity and Judaism too in early Islam. And as I said recently in another conversation, people speak, I mean, I hear people speaking about the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? I mean, that's a concept that has become very popular in the 20th century. I'm not against it. You know, there's a Judeo-Christian tradition. But as I say, there's something missing there.
Yeah, the hyphen.
There's a Judeo-Christo-Islamic tradition.
Yeah, we need the second hyphen. Yeah.
Yeah, you need a second hyphen, and
Yeah.
because this is a trilogy, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there are 3 religions that are connected with each other. And once we begin to read our religious traditions in that perspective, I think it will build bridges. And let's not forget that, I mean, there are theological gaps and differences. There are the same gaps and differences exist actually more so between Judaism and Christianity as well. I mean, the divinity of Jesus is not accepted by Judaism as well, right? Jews. And Islam actually takes quite a few steps forward and accepts Jesus as a prophet, venerates him, even confirms the virgin birth. So it's incredibly actually close to some of the Christian doctrines. But and the gap between Judaism and Christianity, unfortunately, had led to anti-Semitism throughout history. But at some point, I think Christians began to look more mature and say, well, we come from Judaism and Jews are God's chosen people. And, you know, we have so many values. Let's focus on them instead of focusing on this difference between us. And I think it's past time that we discover the connections and the similarities and the commonalities, you know, between Islam and these 2 other faith traditions. And we should respect Judaism because we all come from there, right? I mean,
Yeah, the older
certainly,
sibling.
I mean, we don't have
Yeah.
a Jewish friend here today, but the Jewish tradition is incredibly powerful and more ancient. And the Bible is the basis of the later a lot of the wisdom that we see in our own texts. But I mean, we need to take that step, like building, okay, these are not enemies. We have a Judeo-Christo-Islamic tradition. And honestly, Craig, you're like a historic, I think, doing a historic job in that important mission of building this gap and understanding. So thank you for that.
Yeah, and the mission, you know, continues and carries on. And folks like yourself and even listening to you made me think about Juan Cole's excellent recent book on Muhammad being the prophet of peace, and really contextualizing by using the Quran, by the way, Juan Cole's book, Mustafa, as you did, you know, basically saying some of these passages about Jewish people that if you read literally without any context, like it doesn't sound great, but it's not speaking about Jews for eternity, that they must be treated certain ways. It's speaking about a certain context. And you also mentioned the Battle of Mu'tah. And this, you make a good point. The religion was not what sparked this conflict. And it actually reminds me of, I think, of another really important moment in the history of Christian and Muslim relations, or let's say, even if we could expand this, like now we're talking civilizations between the so-called West and Islam. 1786 and 1796, when the United States was getting its feet off the ground, the first 2 presidents, Washington and Adams, entered into the Treaty of Tripoli with the so-called Barbary states. And if you read the language of that document, it's actually quite remarkable. The United States is saying, we are not a Christian nation, and we have no enmity against Muslims. And the Barbary Wars happened shortly after that, and the treaty kind of crumbles away. But most scholars, I'm not a scholar on the Barbary Wars, but the top scholars say that religion did not spark that conflict. It was politics. It was, people breaking treaties,
Exactly.
but it
I
didn't
mean,
have anything to do with religion.
we see the gap that religion causes in the Najran affair, Najran Christians affair. They come, they disagree on Trinity, but Prophet Muhammad says, okay, you're free to worship, because Islam recognizes the legitimacy of Christianity and Judaism, which was later expanded to Buddhism and Hinduism in let's say India and the subcontinent. But and the same thing was not shown for idolatry. And I'm not saying this today that idolaters should be targeted or anything like that, but that I'm speaking of the historical reality. But then wars came, and I mean, Ottoman Empire fought. I mean, Muslims swept from Spain, to India and conquered a lot of the Christian lands. One thing that is interesting is that some Christians and Jews actually were happy with Islamic conquests against the Byzantines. You know why? Because they were, for the Byzantines, heretical Christians, which put them in trouble. Muslims don't care which Christian is heretical, right? I mean, after giving taxes and accepting a certain status, Christians could preserve their faith. Especially Jews, we know that, that they welcomed in the Middle East and Spain Islamic conquests. And then came the Spanish Reconquista, swept the Iberian Peninsula, forced Jews and Muslims to convert or to flee, which they did, and Jews came to the Ottoman Empire or North Africa. Yeah. I mean, was the Spanish Catholic Reconquista a good representative of Christianity?
I don't.
Probably not,
so.
Right? Yes. I mean, forcing people to convert and otherwise checking if they are true believers through the Inquisition and torturing people. I mean, that was a bad episode in the history of Christianity, which I don't think it represents Christianity, and I don't hold Christianity responsible for that.
Yeah, imagine that. I mean, imagine looking at and viewing a entire faith in over 1 billion people worldwide through the prism of one event. I mean, that's just intellectually lazy. Yeah. The other thing, Mustafa, about 1492. In addition to the Reconquista, right? So Muslims get to Andalusia in 711. They're there for quite some time. And then it's also the migration of Christianity across the Atlantic Ocean with Columbus to the New World. Mm-hmm. And if you read, Columbus was Catholic. If you read some of his diaries, all of these primary sources, it's drastic language. I mean, stuff that we would see out of like a kind of ISIS affiliated group. It's basically completely gung-ho. You either convert or that's it. I mean, we're going to do whatever we want with you. So interesting kind of historical contemporary parallels. And I actually, if you don't mind, bringing us into the contemporary realm. So
sure.
Even moving beyond our books, our two recent books, I'm working on another manuscript, and this is looking more specifically at contemporary relations, but trying to understand what's happening today through the prism of history. And I'm looking at the experiences of Christians in Muslim majority countries, and then Muslims in the so-called, Christian West. Mm-hmm. And what's unfortunate in this research, Mustafa, is that the situation generally for these two populations is not necessarily great. Like the hardest places in the world to be a Christian are arguably in Muslim majority countries. Mm-hmm. And then we could flip it with Muslims having a difficult time in certain European countries. So does anything stick out to you in light of current contemporary challenges? I'm looking at countries like Pakistan, Nigeria. Like what sticks out to you?
Yeah. First of all, on one slight nuance, I'll disagree with you, if you allow me. The places that are worse for Muslims are not Christian majority countries. It's places like China, India, North Korea, I'm sure, although I don't think there are too many Muslims in North Korea to be persecuted in the first place, but let's say authoritarian regimes. And Burma, of course, has been terrible against Myanmar Muslims. And when you look into Christian majority countries, because almost all of them are also kind of democracies with certain level of religious freedom, I think there's less problem, although there might be fanatic groups or bigoted people saying nasty things about Muslims. So that sort of thing happens everywhere. I mean, too. But I think institutionally, legal discrimination. I mean, France has some problems, but that is because of laïcité and secularism rather than Christianity as such. It's not very tolerant to Christianity either. I mean, French
religion.
So that's a separate problem in itself. I mean, the thing is, here I'll be honest, Craig, and I'll now speak a little bit about reform and liberty issues in Islam. Christianity, I think, has taken, Western Christianity at the very least, has taken a conscious step forward towards religious freedom and tolerance in the past few centuries. Before that, it was not good, right? I mean, look at 17th century, early 17th century Europe, 30 Years' War, Catholics, Protestants, slaughter, and people being burned at the stake and beheaded and all that kind of thing. I mean, one of the stories I tell in my book is how Servetus was burnt alive, in Geneva.
Because he
was the orders of Calvin, right?
Yeah, he was a unit. He was more Unitarian.
More Unitarian.
Yes.
At least he was not a Trinitarian, 100%. So
yes.
He was, so there was a time that Christianity, as you pointed out, I mean, Columbus read that, a lot of terrible things were happening. That gradually, finally, was challenged by Christians themselves. I think it began with the ideas of people like John Locke or Roger Williams in the United States, the U.S. Constitution, separation of church and state, and Catholicism was a bit late actually coming to the scene, but Catholic Church has taken admirable steps towards religious freedom with the Second Vatican, even before that too, but reviving Christian humanism. And so today, Christians don't think that people should be killed for heresy, right? So, but they did for 1,000 years. I think some Christians did. That transformation hasn't fully taken place in certain parts of the Muslim world. Not all, I'm not saying all parts of the Muslim world, but there are still pockets of orthodoxy in the Muslim world today. Pakistan sometimes looks like to me like early 17th century Europe, where if you're blamed for blasphemy, you are that Balkan person. I mean, like you will be jailed or somebody will come after you. Or if you're an Ahmadi Muslim, which is very unorthodox, I'm not saying it's orthodox, but very unorthodox, but Muslim group, and at least they have the right to define themselves, even if we consider it in a different way. But, they are persecuted in Pakistan, or like conversion from Islam to Christianity is considered a crime. I lectured against that in Malaysia.
Saw something recently in the news. There's a certain province in Malaysia or
Kelantan.
state.
Yeah,
yes,
there's a Kelantan province where Sharia is applied, and in the whole country, apostasy is they don't send apostates to jail, but they send them to rehabilitation centers, right? And that's a mild case. I argued against that in a public lecture in Malaysia, and I said religion cannot be policed. And then next day, the religion police arrested me. So there are issues. That's why my new book, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance, challenges some of these issues. There are, of course, other Muslims challenging these things. So that's why I sometimes say we need the Lockean revolution at this point in Islam. Again, this doesn't define the whole Muslim world. And what is interesting is that before that evolution in Christianity, Islamic world was relatively actually better. You see this, for example, John Bodin, who was a French advocate of religious freedom, one of the early ones in the 16th century. He says, look at the Ottomans, they allow, people to live with their conscience, because in the Ottoman Empire, you could be an Armenian or Catholic or Protestant or Greek or Jew. It wasn't equal citizenship, so that would come much later. But in the 16th century, you would escape from Europe to the Ottoman Empire, and people did. Jews and even Unitarians. There are Unitarians who fled from Europe who went to the Ottoman Empire. Today, it's the other way around, because I think things got much better in Christendom, basically. Although, again, ideologically, there might be intolerant people, but I think legal structure, the constitutional system changed dramatically for the better. But in the Islamic world, there has been good developments, but also there are reactionary movements. Some things even got worse. My city, Istanbul, was half of it was non-Muslim a century ago. Today, it's 99.9% Muslim, or I mean, secular people, but they're not Greek or Armenian or thing. And this happened in Turkey. The problem is mainly nationalism more than Islamic doctrine. But in other places, in parts of the Muslim world today, certainly in Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, there is an Islamic understanding and interpretation of the Sharia that is oppressive, intolerant. Even if it is tolerant by pre-modern standards, it's not acceptable today. Like to say, okay, we allow your church, but you will pay extra taxes and you'll have less rights, and your testimony at a court will be half of a Muslim, by these medieval definitions. I think we need to work on these issues in Islam, and that's my work is mostly about, actually. So I think we should be honest to put these things, but to say that things can never change and this will be always like it is. I mean, I'll remind them the Christian story. I mean, things change dramatically in Christianity towards religious freedom and toleration, and Islam has the same resources and roots. Certain steps have already been taken, but there's lots to do.
So talk about kind of some of these. We're talking about solutions, really. So like both of us are advocates for freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, and some of these fundamental human rights, and we see these being challenged globally. So what are the solutions? If you had to give practical advice, are we talking, does this change need to happen organically? Is it a bottom up? Is it a top down by top down? I mean, are we looking at like legislation? We have to focus on governance and politics. Like what? So much needs to happen. And I guess I would love to hear you kind of unpack that.
Well, you need top down and you need bottom up. Top down in the sense of not dictating people how they should live or how they will practice their religion, but top down in the sense that, countries sometimes need to change legislation. I mean, in Pakistan, there was an effort called Islamization of laws in the 70s, which brought all these oppressive understandings. Pakistan's founding was much better.
Yes,
I mean, the founder of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, he has this famous speech a year after the founding in 1948, I think, or maybe
about the places of worship, right?
Yeah, he says, I mean, you're free. I mean, you're free to go to your mosques and temples and churches. It's not the business of the state. It's like a First Amendment, Pakistani version in terms of religious freedom, like non-establishment clause, if you will. And Pakistan was defined as an Islamic state, but the actual, idea was religious freedom. But, that was pushed back by some powerful forces, which, brought a lot of these oppressive laws, which Pakistan is suffering from now today. Minorities in Pakistan, even the majority, I mean, people from the majority who just disagree with the militants out there. So there are things about legal issues that, I mean, governments can make laws and, they make a change. But if people believe the government should preserve this law, like apostasy should be a crime, and the government should punish apostasy because that's what our religion tells us. So you have a bottom-up issue here as well. You have to work within the community saying that, no, actually, that's not what our religion says. Or, some of our religion's texts wrote that 12 centuries ago, but it was a whole different world. Apostasy meant a different thing. It was meant rebellion to the state, people freely changing their religion, or like, do we? I think one key issue is, do we want others the same freedom we want for ourselves? I mean, that's really the golden rule. Like Muslims, of course, would like to distribute the Qurans in Western cities, which they do, and open, Islamic centers and mosques and wear the hijab. And I'm all for those rights. And I'm also critical of the Western governments sometimes who are like France, who are limiting some of these freedoms, or the circles who ask for limitations. But do we give the exact same rights to Christians, right? Can they distribute Bibles in Mecca? I would say yes. Of course, Saudis will never say yes, but I mean, that's what I think we should have these conversations in the Muslim community. So it's a bottom up. It is a top down and bottom up at the same place. And the thing is, the Islamic scene is, as I'm sure others are, very diverse. So there are people who are really, I mean, it's a spectrum. I honestly represent a more liberal reformist edge of the spectrum, let's say, than not the secular people who don't care about religion. So that's another thing. But I care about religion, but try to understand that it's historical and it has to be interpreted. Then there's a big conservative mainstream, which is not going to exactly take some of the steps I'm arguing, but they're not going to be oppressive right away. Then there are hardliners, and then there are the darkest, terrorists and militant groups that really go after people. And those militants are really a very, very small minority.
They get the most
but the
coverage,
havoc
don't
they
they?
create, I mean, the terror they unleash sometimes to fellow Muslims who just disagree with them, of course, is a big problem. And it captures headlines, and it unfortunately defines an image of Islam for a lot of people, which shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, and this kind of brings our discussion full circle. You started talking about how the extremes, from whether you want to refer to it as Islamophobia or, radical Islam, some of these buzzwords, like these are the narratives from these entities seem to be dictating how we think about each other. And they seem to influence our relations. And that's unfortunate. I mean, a lot of this is due just to the nature of the media. As I tell my students, if it bleeds, it leads. And that's what we're going to hear. But we don't hear about some of these other more constructive examples, like even recently in Mosul, like some incredible interfaith work has unfolded in Mosul, a city really ransacked by imperial powers and then also by ISIS. Mm-hmm. And, you have Muslims working with Christians to rebuild Christian churches, which is really quite reflective of Muhammad's some of the documented agreements that he had with the Christians. And like, we really don't hear about these stories. They're peaceful.
I mean, one thing about ISIS, like I wrote, I mean, ISIS is the Khmer Rouge of the whole, scene. It's like the worst of the worst of, like, I mean, imagine that today Taliban looks quite more moderate compared to ISIS. So the ISIS level of insanity is something else. And when ISIS was destroying Christian communities in Mosul, like I remember I said, well, this is horrible and we should side with the Christians. And we should not forget that these Christian communities have been in Mosul for 14 centuries before ISIS, under Islamic majorities. I mean, under the Ottoman Empire, under Iraq, under before other Abbasids or, whomever, all the, I mean, it's things like, Copts. I mean, the very fact that they're Eastern Christians show you that these people survived, although not ideal. I mean, they should have equal citizenship. They didn't. The Ottoman Empire, by the way, actually declared equal citizenship in 1876, but it never fully matured because of the political turmoil and ended terribly. But some of the stuff that we're seeing today in the name of Islam is like the worst of it. Like, we've never seen something this insane for a very long time. And again, it's like this is a dark era. I mean, it's like the 17th century, early Christian Europe, where, oh my God, like millions are killing each other for sect. I mean, that was not even for medieval Christianity, that was too much. And that triggered writings of religious freedom and toleration. I mean, look at all the great writings about religious freedom and toleration in that era. It's all influenced by, I mean, it's all coming from people seeing the horrors of these things.
Yes.
I mean, Roger Williams, I read his life a little bit, for example, in the US, I mean, the founder of Rhode Island. He'd seen how persecution was terrible in Massachusetts, right? Your home country.
Yeah, my home city.
Massachusetts is a great place now, but in the 1640s or something, it had some religious freedom problems, right? I mean,
because he was talking, and again, this is all through primary documents, like, there are quotes from Roger Williams, who is arguably the true founding father of the United States, at least in terms of religious freedom. And he was saying, like, I want to live in a society where, he was using terms like infidel, Catholic, Mohammedan. He even said the word Mohammedan, or whatever the 17th
Mahometan
century.
or something.
Yeah, with a T. Yeah. And I mean, imagine that. He was the Puritans of Boston at the time. They forget about tolerating Islam. I mean, they weren't.
They would
They
have
weren't even
tolerated other
tolerating.
Christians.
Yeah, they weren't
Yeah.
even tolerating other Christians. I mean, if you read have you ever read the Mayflower Papers, Mustafa? This is
No,
it's a
I know
book.
Mayflower, but didn't read the papers yet.
So it's a book by Nathaniel Philbrick, and it's a collection of the primary documents of these individuals who made up the first couple of decades and centuries of Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in these papers, they outline their theology and their vision for society. And when I read this was back in maybe 2011, 2012. It reminded me of some of these ultra orthodox, whatever you want to call it, strands of Sunni Islam.
Yeah.
This whole, and it's all puritanical. It's a desire to cleanse the faith of something that has brought contamination.
Yeah, it's Wahhabism.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
There you go. The other thing I wanted to bring up as we're wrapping up, Mustafa, is a lot of the tension I feel around some of the more hot spots of Christian-Muslim relations, they revolve around buildings. And so Hagia Sophia, in particular, I know when Hagia Sophia was recently brought into the news with President Erdogan reconverting it, or however you wanted to define it, I came out publicly and I said, I would rather it remain how it is, kind of this interfaith monument, if you could refer to that, or if Muslims were going to be given the right to pray, Christians should also be given the right to pray.
That was my thesis too. For 2 decades, I've written about that.
Yes, that was my approach. We see it elsewhere with the church mosque, or the cathedral mosque in Cordoba.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of tension in Cordoba over this issue, and it just brings me back to Muhammad's example. This is one of the many reasons why I admire him, and it was because of the Christian of Najran story, which you brought up. And this, and Mustafa, maybe you can comment on this, because I think you're going to agree with the essence of what I'm saying. So Muhammad provides a space inside his mosque for another religious community to engage in their prayer, an extraordinary act. And I think beyond this kind of similarity between Christianity and Islam, Muhammad is sending a very profound message that you're not compromising your faith by being hospitable, and that this is actually part of faith. I don't know. What do you think of that?
That's for sure. I mean, people are sometimes inhospitable or militant or oppressive. Sometimes really they're fanatic and they think that's what the real faith requires. But very often, especially in the modern era, there's another element. They're insecure about their faith, right? I mean, they fear that they will never allow Bible to be distributed on streets because they think, oh my God, people will read it and everybody will believe into this and they will go to hell and all of that. Of course, I mean, whether salvation is only for our people or broader, and that's also an interesting discussion there. I believe in, the Quran itself actually promises salvation for Jews, Christians, and other ethical monotheists, if you will.
That's a controversial point, because I have read similar passages, and I've said that, and people are like, don't say that.
Don't say that. I think the thing is, Islamics, it's there right there in the Quran. I mean, I can share the number of verses later, but you probably know. I mean, it says, those who believe, the believers, those who are Christians and Jews and the Sabians, and who were the Sabians in this question, but these people who believe in God and the last day and have good deeds, they will not have fear. So that's like a verse in the Quran. So the Quran, very interestingly, promises salvation for Muslims, people who are not Muslims, but who are monotheists, broadly speaking, and who are good people, like who have good deeds, right? I mean, they should be ethical. So it's interesting, though, that this was the mainstream Sunni interpretation said, no. This means that only until Islam came, they were fine, right? But once they hear the call of Islam and they see it, they have to accept it. Otherwise, they're not saved. Now, this was not enough. Then another layer came and it says, no, it's not all Muslims. It's our sect, right?
Yeah.
There are 72 sects who will, go to hell. Only one is saved. That's a hadith, but very disputable one. And there's an alternative version to it, which actually quite much more broad in its. It says actually only one sect will not be saved, and all others will be saved. But the one that became popular was the more sectarian one, because I think our religious traditions or sects throughout history thought that it's not a good marketing strategy to say others can be saved too, because come here, this is the only tent, otherwise you're doomed. But I think there's no theological maturity in that. I mean, everybody, I think, has the right to say our doctrine is the most true and the most accurate one. That's why you're in there, right? I mean, I understand that. But to say God is only ours and he will only save us and he will punish. I mean, that is kind of, for the sake of your exclusivism, you're depicting a God who's not merciful and who's not just, because
Right.
what's the fault of somebody born in Guatemala compared to someone born in Algeria, or vice versa, or someone who's born as a Buddhist or Hindu? I'm not kind of trying to push out the non-Abrahamic scene here. I mean, they're all God's creation. So if God is merciful and just, and if people are following their faith traditions, as most people are doing, and they're being good people, I think there's no theological wisdom in saying that no, they're going to be doomed.
It really brings us back to the $1 million question. Who is God? What is God's nature? As you mentioned, is God merciful and compassionate? I would definitely like to think so.
Yeah.
Or
definitely.
are we going to look at him as this very kind of conservative judge who has like a checklist of things? If you do this, you have to 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 do all these things to pass, to get through. Mustafa, what are you working on in the future here? So you had Islamic Jesus, one of my favorite books. You had Reopening Muslim Minds, which came out, what is it, half a year ago now?
April.
In April. So what's on the agenda?
Well, I have another book which I'm just beginning to write, but it will take a while to finish and publish. Guess what its name could be after the Islamic Jesus?
The Muhammad, the Christian Muhammad.
It is titled The Islamic Moses, a brief story of the Judeo-Islamic tradition.
Oh, nice. That'll be an epic one too.
Because it won't be not just about Moses, sorry, but the Moses is the most prominent figure in the whole Quran, but with an interesting little nuance from the Bible, which is very interesting. And I'll begin with that, but then I'll tell the story of Muslims and Jews, which was a story until the 20th century, mostly a bright story of coexistence. Yeah. And it will include mutual learnings between, like mutual enrichment between Jews and Christians. Jews adopted part of Islamic theology and Muslims learn from Jewish sources. And so it will be a bridge between Jews and Muslims, which is much needed. Exactly.
Given what's happening in the Holy Land. And actually this morning I was teaching my students at Rice the recent history of this, Israel-Palestine conflict, which obviously raises a lot of emotions. A lot of people are quite sensitive about this issue. So, well, can't wait to read what's coming next. And the work that I'm developing, I'm playing around with Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and Muhammad Khatami and Pope Francis's Dialogue of Civilizations, and actually adding a third component, which is the synthesis of civilizations. And I think there are periods in history in which Christians, Muslims, and Jews, I'm focusing primarily on Christians and Muslims, create a kind of new way of being, a new type of society that really blurs these kind of identity categories where we see ourselves as either Christian or Muslim. It's much more, it's kind of hybrid. And I'm looking at the potential out of this fusion of civilizational values, of religious values, of cultural values. And it's always tied, all these moments in history, they're tied to its education it's science, it's knowledge, it's things that people can work, regardless of faith, you can work on together for the benefit of all and for the progress of society. So we'll see how that
And
how that book unfolds.
that's beautiful perspective. And a synthesis of civilizations is already like taking place.
Yeah.
In countries like US, where you have faith traditions, as neighbors. I mean, Jews, Muslims, Christians, everybody, especially in countries with immigration and diversity. And I think a healthy Muslimhood is developing in Western society. And because, especially in America, because I think many Muslims are seeing that to be a good Muslim, you don't need an Islamic state. You need a state that gives you life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, basically.
Which are,
which is better. The so-called Islamic State will probably come and dictate to you whatever its version is. And
and we have a prime example in DC, which I'll be visiting in a couple weeks here, in the Supreme Court chamber, where there's a frieze of some of the greatest lawgivers in the history of humanity. And this was a frieze erected by a German sculptor, but under the guidance of FDR, President Roosevelt. And Muhammad is honored, right? And this is really one of these things where like American values and Islamic values just kind of they fuse into, it's not one. We're not saying that they're the same, but there is enough commonality here to work with. And like those commonalities are crucial to us.
Totally agreed. And inshallah, hope to see you in DC then.
Yeah. December 8th to the 12th. I'll be there. And hopefully I'll either bring you to a good Italian restaurant, or maybe you can pick a Turkish spot. And I know there's probably some Pakistanis in the audience, so there could be some competition here. But I'm all for it. I'm all for all of it, actually.
Yeah, totally. Same here. All these options really sound good, and thank you. So inshallah, we'll plan for that. And thank you, Shahid. Hopefully this was a helpful conversation.
No, thank you, definitely, Mustafa. Thank you, Craig. Really appreciate the conversation. I think what we took away from this is there is a lot of opportunity to work on things together. And there's too much commonality there. And I'm looking forward to reading your next books. And for everybody in the audience, you got to check out Craig's new book, People of the Book, and also Mustafa's book, The Islamic Jesus. It's a pretty great book. Both of them are great. If you guys are interested in religious dialogue, I think it's a great foundational piece. And there is too much that we can do together, and looking forward to furthering these conversations. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam, and thank you so much. Thank you,
Peace,
Craig.
everyone.
Thank you,
Take
Shahid,
care,
and thanks
everyone.
to everyone who joined us tonight.
Thanks, everyone. God bless everyone. Take care.